Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Freeman. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Association of Museums. And this is episode 7 of our monthly blog series that we're releasing this week on digital fluency topics featured in our Houston-based Finding Alternative Futures Phase 2 project. This project examines digital readiness and easily available technologies that can help move the Houston and greater Texas museum community forward. This month, we feature the white paper written by Ed Rodley titled Looking for the Light at the End of the Tunnel. I'm joined again by our museum scholar in residence, Ed Rodley from the Experience Alchemist. Welcome, Ed.
Hey, Alex, good to be here.
Great. So we released this white paper to our members right before the holidays. And this post is intended to be the public facing where anyone can download it and read your writing from that kind of looks at what we've done over the past few months. So I'll go ahead and get some highlights from that white paper and kind of directions for the future. We've done some evaluations and we've had four modules of coaching, or four modules of online work and months of coaching with our FAF2 participants. So what have you learned from reviewing some of that information?
Well, so probably the 4 biggest things that came out of the evaluation results, and this is what the FAF2 cohort participants are telling us, as opposed to what we are trying to impose on them. The things that came out as sort of themes across the board for everyone who's participating in FAF Phase 2 are sort of fourfold. So first of all, the realization that what we tend to call digital transformation isn't really digital per se. Really what we're talking about when we talk about digital transformation is about changing the way we think about how we work together, right? So most of it has to do with people much more than it has to do with digital technologies. The second point is kind of counterintuitive given the fact that we're living in this strange time period when no one knows what the future is going to hold. But the importance of having a strategy, a strategic plan, and being able to do realistic goal setting now more than ever seems to be an important consideration for museums in the cohort. So the idea of where you have very limited resources, very limited time, being clear about what is the most important thing to your organization so that you can focus on the stuff that is important and not worry about the rest of it has become probably the thing that separates people who are surviving well from everybody else, right? The ones who are able to have that strategic focus, even though we don't know, are we going to be open 3 months from now? Is there going to be another wave after Omicron? There are all kinds of things that seem to be obstacles to traditional strategic planning, yet there is still the need to actually have a strategy. And in 2022, it is probably going to be even more important to be clear about what your strategy is and how you intend to get there, even more so than it was in 21. Third, a lot of the participants spent a lot of time talking about their own journey as learners in understanding firsthand now what the differences are between digital audiences and on-site audiences. So for many members of the cohort, they hadn't had a tremendous amount of experience dealing with online audiences, and this notion that they are different, right? They are geographically dispersed sometimes. There are all kinds of differences between the way that you can deal with them asynchronously as opposed to, the program is at 2 o'clock and it runs until 2:20. All of those things that they are coming to understand now becomes very important, particularly now where everybody is thinking about reopening or is mostly reopen and trying to deal with this new hybrid reality, right? Lots of people have expressed profound appreciation and desire to hang on to their digital audiences, which was great when everybody was closed and all you had were digital audiences. But now there's this pressure to go back to all of the on-site things that we used to do while not losing these new digital audiences, many of whom are never going to come to the physical institution. So how do you hang on to them? How do you learn to work with them, hopefully to get some percentage of them to turn into tighter members of your community, right? To drive donations, to try to bring them in closer in the way that we have decades of experience doing with physical audiences. That is a thing that everybody is wrestling with right now. And then the last thing that came out of this was that regardless of how much the pandemic has affected everybody, for the half of the members of TAM that are the smallest organizations, right, the 0 to 2 full-time employees, they are suffering more than anybody else, not surprisingly, right? So everybody's suffering, but the small organizations are really getting hit much, much harder, proportionally speaking, than anybody else. So trying to figure out what to do about that, I think, is going to be an issue for all museum associations in 22 and probably going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two of those points, I've been speaking a lot to museum directors across the state, and really this idea about of working on the strategic plan is really top of mind across the state. Of really, okay, we've survived the worst of this pandemic. How is this going to inform how we approach our work moving into the future? How do we approach staffing? That's always a big issue, and that's something I'm hearing a lot of. And to your point about online audiences and versus on-site, as a museum association, we put on an annual meeting every year. And the past 2 years, we've been remote, online, virtual. And so we've developed an audience over 2 years that we're growing. And some of those folks may not be able to come to the annual meeting because they have geographical challenges or financial challenges, or they're just busy and can't make it to the annual meeting. So I want to find ways that we think of things within hybrid, so that we don't abandon those online attendees. And so with planning for this annual meeting that's coming up in March, we do have a virtual component on demand, best of, with live streaming keynotes, so that we can connect both of those on-site and online audiences, so that we don't lose all those folks that that audience we've built over the years. So the link to the white paper is in the blog post, and it's free and accessible to anyone. Now let's look at this project in comparison with the broader museum field. How does this project look compared to the larger ecosystem of museums in 2021? What were you seeing from this past year?
Well, interestingly, I think what we're experiencing in Texas museums is not all that different from what museums all over the planet are experiencing. There have been a number of reports that came out at the end of 21 and in the last couple of weeks at the beginning of 22, trying to look back and pull out, like, okay, what were the big things in 21, and probably the biggest three in terms of what people in the museum sector are worrying about is cultivating sustainability. So sustainability in the sense that if you're going to hang on to online audiences, that means staff need to actually be dedicated to work with those audiences. And there's not a lot of hiring going on at the moment, right? We are still in sort of an era of retrenchment. So then how do you divvy up the resources to actually sustain that audience that we've grown over the last, say, 18 months? How do we not abandon them, as you put it earlier? And then the other thing is lots of folks are worrying about, or not worrying, lots of folks are trying to understand how to actually increase the accessibility of all of the work that has gone into their digital products, right? So it's not enough to just make them. If nobody actually finds what you're putting out online, then that's not really successful effort. And this difference between making things and making things findable, right? Where are the people going online, and how do you get your content in front of them in ways that they will consume, are things that everybody is trying to crack right now. And I think when we get to talking about what might be happening in 2022, there are some examples of ways people are thinking about trying to do this. The other thing that didn't show up in the FAF phase 2 responses, but has been sort of, I don't know, it seized the popular imagination last year, was this craze for immersion suddenly, right? There are 2 immersive Van Gogh exhibits in Houston alone, and there are almost 50 in the US alone in 2021. And this whole phenomenon of big, splashy, projected image sort of spectacles has really just been happening everywhere, right? It's happening here, it's happening in Asia, it's happening in Australia and in Europe. Like there is a particular moment right now where people want to get out, they want to get out safely. And these places that are just gigantic empty rooms give you plenty of room to socially distance, but also see other people. Like it clearly scratches a lot of itches, right? People are tired of just doing things in their living room. They want to get out. How can you get out safely? Well, if you're standing inside a 40,000 square foot empty department store, looking at projections of, blue chip artists' artworks, then people are making the decision that that's an acceptable way to spend the time that they reserve for cultural experiences. So small C cultural experiences. And there's been a lot of very uncharitable things said, particularly in the art world press, about these immersive experiences. But I think for us, I think one of the things that hasn't gotten enough attention is not necessarily the immersiveness of these things, but the fact that every single one of them is driven by some named artist, right? People aren't going to see the immersive Ed Rodley show, much to my chagrin, nor the immersive Alex Freeman. They're going to see immersive Van Gogh, immersive Kahlo, immersive Michelangelo. So they are deciding that they want to actually consume culture, right? They want to go see artwork done by artists that are in the canon. And they're deciding that museums aren't the place to go see that, which is kind of strange. So I think there is an opportunity there for institutions to be thinking about, okay, well, how do we do something like that, that actually does the things that we do well with the things that people are obviously interested in doing, right? People aren't just out to see spectacles, because then you could see, immersive anything. They're all straight up, middle of the road kind of exhibition topics from the old days. The only difference is now there are no objects in most of these things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I've been visiting some museums recently and looking at talking to the gift shop managers, and they're saying, people aren't buying postcards anymore. They're not buying mugs anymore. They're not buying calendars or T-shirts. And so like the people are interested in, I think this is what they're doing. They're going into these immersive environments. They're connecting with Van Gogh by being inside of a painting rather than buying a reproduction or something like that.
Yeah, and I think we can waste a lot of time and energy debating whether or not this is a good thing, which doesn't really help. If people are deciding that this is a way that they want to spend their free time that they would otherwise spend at museums, then it's something we need to pay attention to. Because they're making the choice to spend $60 a ticket to go spend 20-30 minutes in immersive Van Gogh versus a comparable sum of money to take a couple of people or 3 people to go to the museum and spend as many hours as they want. So clearly there is something there for us. We just have to be, I think, a little bit intentional about what parts of that we think are worth understanding and possibly replicating, right? So an example that's in, I think it's in the white paper, is the Cleveland Museum of Art just, I think currently has an exhibition up on Cambodian art, where they're basically doing some of the same things, right? So their exhibition's called Revealing Krishna, and it has many of the same kinds of like really large scale immersive projections. So you can get a feeling of like, what is it like in Cambodia? What is it like where these artworks that are physically in the gallery actually came from? So you can sort of see them in their original context. So I expect we're going to see more and more museums taking that step of trying to do the things they've done, bring in more immersive elements. I think physically make them larger to actually accommodate people safely. And that seems like it is a path forward.
It reminds me, the pre-pandemic times, I saw a lot of on showroom floors, a lot about VR technology. And some of the conversations I had at the time were like, it's a very solitary experience with VR. You're kind of in and what's really great is if everyone could have that type of experience. And I think we're kind of seeing that because with that the need to find a more way of social being in a virtual environment, but also being able to be social and talk about that environment as you walk through.
Right, and that's an important thing, that this kind of projection-based immersion, which I think a lot of the popular press tends to emanate from technology companies and people who are tech boosters, right? So they want to talk about VR and why VR is great, and projectors projecting flat images is just boring to them. But the reality is, for visitors, it gives you all of the affordances of putting on a headset, none of the struggle of trying to figure out how the heck do you work this thing. And to your point, you can turn to the person with you and say, isn't this great? And they can look at you and say, yes, because you're both seeing the same thing, which is very hard to do with current VR technology. Regardless of what Mark Zuckerberg and everybody else is going to tell you, we're not there yet, right? Alex, you and I have been around long enough to see that, virtual reality has been on the, it's gonna be popular in 2 to 3 years for what, 15 years now. It's always not quite there. And even though Facebook has turned into Meta and people are now talking about the metaverse like it's a new thing, we're probably not going to have to worry about it next year, right. Maybe in 2 to 3 years.
And these immersive environments, they pass what I think Rob Stein called the sneeze test, which is if somebody sneezed in a VR helmet right before you, would you want to put it on?
Yeah, and the answer is no. For all of these things. So those are sort of the big things that I've been seeing in my scan of the literature for 2021, with the obvious caveat of non-fungible tokens. We're not going to go there in this conversation. I advise everyone else to just not go there anytime soon.
Okay, so let's talk about let's put our forecasting hats on. What are you seeing happening in 2022 now that we're kind of we've seen a shift and people are going to be moving in direction? What directions are they going in?
Well, having just said, let's not talk about NFTs. You're going to see lots of, strangely enough, most of the incredibly well-endowed art museums are going to be noisily announcing NFT initiatives probably throughout the year. They have the wherewithal and the, I can't think of the right word to describe it, but it's in their wheelhouse. They're going to dabble. The British Museum has done it. The Tate has done it. You're going to see lots of other big art museums that theoretically are doing quite well already anyway, trying to figure out new ways to make money off of that. For the 99.98% of the rest of the museum sector, don't go there. But people will be talking about it. So if nothing else, finding some good explainers online to understand what non-fungible tokens are and how they relate to objects and artworks is an important thing, if only to spare yourself from having to explain what are NFTs over and over and over again. Likewise, you're going to see, just because of Meta's size, people are going to be talking about the metaverse. So immersive virtual environments, it's going to come up again and again and again. We're already seeing announcements of large museums starting to partner with various virtual reality companies to think about ways of projecting into these virtual environments more museum-like experiences. But again, I think that's something most of us aren't going to have to worry too much about. And to your point about the sneeze test, most people aren't going to engage in these things. So I think it's safe to keep an eye on them, but not worry too much about them over the next 12 months. The things that I'm seeing that people are doing that are things that I think are lessons worth looking at. Lots of institutions are trying to figure out ways to deal with regional audiences, right? So, we're not out of the pandemic yet, but maybe we're getting out of the pandemic, but people aren't traveling. Traditional tourism models are still completely disrupted, basically. But everybody still has a region that they are located in. And there are, in the before times, I would say many institutions tended to think very, very locally, right? The neighborhood that they're in, and then sort of the world at large. And there's this middle range of people who were within, a few hours drive, who in the past would not get a lot of love from museums, because the likelihood of their coming made the cost benefit analysis kind of dicey. But nowadays, those people are a huge audience segment that is potentially untapped by most institutions. And people are willing to go a distance, it seems, to go consume stuff that they would normally like get on a plane and go on vacation to do. They're not doing that now. They're taking a drive somewhere. So in terms of Texas museums, like all of the states around Texas form sort of a larger regional audience who might possibly be interested in things that are being offered. And to go along with that, I'm seeing a lot of museums that have specific sites attached to them, thinking about virtual tours. So, you can't physically come, but here is a thing that you can do that will give you a sense of what it would be like to walk around, whatever, your historic house. If you're a collecting institution that has a bunch of stuff from a place, like that particular place, virtual tours were sort of one of the first things in like Web 1.0 days of you can tour the Parthenon in Athens now by clicking your mouse on our tiny little screen. They're having a real comeback, I think, and you're going to see more and more of them as people continue to try to figure out ways to make up for that travel they used to do. They still want to have that experience of being a cultural tourist, right? I'm looking at new things, I'm learning about different people, but I'm doing it safely in my house in front of my TV or in front of my computer or on my phone. So that seems to be a real potential avenue for folks to explore. And I would say the last thing, which is probably going to take at least maybe 2 years for people to start seeing results of, there are a lot of globally brand new museums being built. There are places, the Arab countries in the Gulf, lots of museums going up in places like Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Dubai. In Asia, people are building brand new museums, and they're building not just brand new buildings, but brand new organizational structures, right? So instead of just adopting sort of the traditional museum model, they're starting from scratch. Like, what do we need to have in order to have a 21st century functioning museum? And that's probably going to wind up looking very different. You're not going to see, there's the curatorial department and the registration department and the visitor services department and all of the traditional silos that we have had over the last century. They're looking pretty wildly divergent, but I think to go back to the beginning of our talk where we were talking about sustainability, if you think about the way most museums are organized and you try to divide people between museum staff who take care of physical visitors and museum staff who take care of online visitors. Like, how many museums have anything even close to parity? Let's not even say parity. Let's say, twice as many people worrying about physical visitors as opposed to online visitors. The percentages for most museums probably aren't even close to that. But these new organizations that are being built with the realization of what is an online audience in the 21st century, you're going to see them looking differently and people are going to have different jobs. So I think there is going to be the opportunity in a couple of years to look at some of these experiments and say oh, that's a model that, bears looking into in terms of how we might reshape our own organizations, because we know museums are very conservative by nature. That's their function, is to conserve and preserve. But that also tends to extend to everything we do, including organizational structures and workflows. And in this case, those aren't really working terribly well in the current moment. So being able to find models of people who are doing it differently and perhaps doing it better is a great shortcut to success, right? It's easier to be second or third. Let somebody else do all of the learning. They can suffer through the experiments that don't work. And then you can sit back and say oh, okay, that piece of that experiment worked. Let's try that. And let's try this piece from this experiment over here.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And for those directors that are working on strategic plans, to watch this space as these new organizations develop new org charts and figure out how to staff a museum in the 21st century without the baggage of the previous century.
Right. And so to give you an example, I'm seeing in more than one of these organizations, units being called something like visitor experience that encompass things that in the past or in a more traditionally organized museum kind of encompasses roles that would be handled by curatorial, education, visitor services, and membership. But by calling them all visitor experience, all these people obviously have a reason to be working together. And it is. I would argue that it was probably going to be easier for them to collaborate than people who are split up in 4 different silos in a more traditionally organized museum. So I think you're going to see some real interesting products come out of those, because they are able to collaborate in ways that are harder to do in traditional museums.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed, for your research and analysis. I went into our white paper and post for this month. If you are interested in joining the conversation, if anyone's interested in joining us, we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Texas Museums. So please comment on our post once we get this up and live. And next month, we'll focus on our last module, Digital Savvy Leadership, that's led by, was created by TAM fellow Eric Ames. With that, I want to say goodbye and thank you, Ed, for your time today. And y'all download that report and connect with us.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye, Ed.
Bye, Alex.